चल हो जा शुरू।
केसरिया से मन जोगी हुआ रे, दिल झूमे देखो पतवारा हुआ रे, दिल झूमे देखो पतवारा हुआ रे।
हर पल मनाओ केसरी त्योहार। विमल, बोलो जुबान केसरी।
All right, welcome back, friends. And Terry Milewski joins us for the benefit of viewers. Let me tell you that he's a veteran who has been in the profession for 4 decades and more. In fact, he interviewed Prime Minister Indira Gandhi way back in 1976. He's someone who has covered the Kanishka bombing from the ground, in the sense that he has, for investigating the terror linkages, traveled from Canada to London, to Ireland, and of course, many parts of India. And then, of course, he has also covered the 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks, India's own 9/11. So he's someone who has seen terror up close and profiled it. In fact, writing a book on the Kanishka bombing and the aftermath called Blood for Blood. And of course, many of you would obviously be familiar with Terry. Whenever we discuss Kanishka, Canada, he's there with us. Very good morning to you there, Terry, and good evening from here. And let's begin by understanding what's really happened over the last 1 week, which has made us have this conversation today. And which is, Terry, that we had those very discomforting pictures coming in from Canada's House of Commons, the Parliament there, where we had the leadership standing in silence and paying homage to Hardeep Singh Nijjar. So far as India is concerned, he was a Khalistani separatist and was on our list. Also, of course, on the Canadian list, no-fly list. What's really happening? Those were very discomforting pictures, Terry.
You're putting it very mildly. It was appalling to see the political leadership in Canada unite around this idea. All parties were involved. They had a quiet little meeting off camera, to agree that they would have this moment of silence for Mr. Nijjar. And there was no public debate about it. Nobody was, you can't sort of find a television clip of any of these politicians saying anything good about Mr. Nijjar, but they snuck it through almost at dead of night, had this moment of silence, and of course everyone was appalled because there are bigger things to be concerned about, and this was sort of a national disgrace, really, which Indians were bound to notice, and particularly when relations are already at a low ebb, to put it mildly, between India and Canada, and this would only make things worse. And of course, it did make things worse. There are a couple of aspects to this, though. That's not the only embarrassing thing to happen in Canada lately. In the past week, just yesterday, for example, the head of the Voice of Sikhs for Justice, which is running a referendum campaign, as you know, on Sikh independence, Gopal Singh Panoon, tweeted a most objectionable, even creepy announcement that he would be funding an investigation into, and I quote, India's role in the Kanishka bombing. Now, as you know, India had no role in the Kanishka bombing, and the authorship of that bombing, Talvinder Parmar, you've already mentioned. This is proven in court multiple times. This is hard evidence. This is not speculation. We know what the evidence is, and it convinced 3 separate criminal trials and the judicial inquiry that Parmar was the mastermind of that bombing. Nevertheless, Mr. Panoon of Sikhs for Justice is saying that they are now allegedly leading the way in sympathy for the victims of the bombing. They are going to find out the real villains, who, of course, he says are the Indian government. They did the bombing. It's absurd. Canada continues to disgrace itself on this file by letting these things happen. It's just intolerable.
Terry, but you know, it goes beyond just being absurd. There has to be some rule of law, right? And there's a lot of pontification on that. You said 3 criminal trials and the jury finding Talvinder Singh Parmar responsible, and yet if Pannu is able to use the pictures of Parmar and talk about a referendum using those posters, and the fact that Pannu is a Canadian citizen, shouldn't the law be kicking in? Shouldn't the agencies be taking note of it? After all, those who were killed in Kanishka bombings were Canadian citizens.
Indeed, you're right about that, but I differ with you on this one point, that it's enough that India should disapprove, that we should somehow ban people saying, uttering political speech, expressing a political opinion. Mr. Pannu, in Canadian law, is free to make a fool of himself and to say these outrageous things as long as he's not committing any act of violence. Although you could argue that he's encouraging and endorsing acts of violence, I would endorse that argument. Nevertheless, it's not a slam dunk case in Canadian law. The problem is that the rest of us also have freedom of speech, but we don't use it. Canadian politicians don't use their freedom of speech to say, I'm not coming to your Vaisakhi parade if you're going to display pictures glorifying the Air India bomber, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history, Talvinder Singh Parmar, which they do routinely. They put a giant life-size picture of him up on the outside of an important Gurdwara in Surrey, British Columbia. He's regarded as a hero. And we let them get away with it. We don't say anything about it. It's easy to say, ban them, lock them up, throw them in jail. No, that's not necessarily the answer. The answer to me is for politicians to show some spine for once and say, no, we're not going to put up with this. We're not coming to your parades. We're not going to try to pander for your votes come election time.
No, Terry, but it seems something has happened. You know, earlier we had, when the Nijjar episode came out, for example, your leader of opposition, Pierre Poilievre, he took a little nuanced position. So he was not sort of buying the government's point, lock, stock and barrel. But then on the day that moment of silence was observed in Parliament, I believe he was there in the House. So it seems something has happened. You think some nudge has come from the United States and hence it's more like a geopolitical game? Because I don't remember last time when for a terrorist the Canadian Parliament held a moment of silence before this.
I wish that I could say that Canadian politicians were astute enough to be playing some deep, dark geopolitical game, as you put it. No, they don't know what they're talking about. They are incurious and they are ignorant about the history of the Khalistan movement. They don't realize what really happened in 1984-85. The deputy leader of the Conservative Party, which you rightly mentioned, because although the focus is on Mr. Trudeau, of course, because he's in power now, the other parties are just as much to blame if they get a crack at a time in power. The deputy leader of the Conservative Party, Tim Uppal, a Sikh member of Parliament and an important one, put out a statement a week or so ago saying, we've got to have 1984 deemed a genocide, and the Indian army was out to destroy, wipe out the Sikh community at the time of the invasion of the Golden Temple in June of 1984. I mean, historically ignorant, absolute rubbish, and it's simply pure Khalistani propaganda. And he, like so many other Canadian politicians, has simply swallowed this propaganda and they repeat it ad infinitum. And nobody calls them out on it. They get away with it because, well, your party can't criticize me for doing it because you do it too. And so does his. And so does hers. They all do it.
So can we say, Terry, that the leadership in Canada, and unfortunately it seems in a bipartisan manner, is willing to sacrifice the India-Canada relationship for their narrow political objective of winning the next election?
Well, if they had a clear objective, yes, you could say that. But as I say, I doubt that they're clever enough to have such a devious agenda. They simply don't know what they're talking about, and they don't realize the damage they do when they endorse the narrative. You know, people come to them and say, "Oh, we must have a moment of silence for this poor Mr. Nijjar," and they say, "Oh yeah, okay, whatever you say," and they don't have anyone whispering in their other ear saying, "You're going to look stupid. The Indians are not going to like this. You're going to make the bad relations even worse. Think about what they're doing." They just accept the propaganda. They don't speak up against it. And I say that free speech is the answer. People like you and me can say what we like. Nobody listens to us. But leadership, political leadership, needs to be shown in Canada to denounce and to disapprove and to disallow the display of terrorist iconography. Worshipping the mass murderer Talvinder Parmar is the classic example. It goes on, and it must stop.
Okay.
Politicians should stay away from that.
You know, just 2 days before this moment of silence was observed in the Canadian Parliamentary, this is my second last question to you, there was a federal court of appeal order or verdict on the petition for removing two Khalistanis, Bhagat Singh Parwarkar and Dulai, to remove them from the no-fly list. And the court actually, while denying their petition, said that they are credible threats to transportation safety. I believe the court did not use the word terror, but the court was clear that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that they will threaten transportation security or travel by air or commit terrorism offense. In fact, the word terror was used. And this is the same no-fly list on which Hardeep Singh Nijjar was also there. So it's not as simple as that. There is a clear case of double standards, and there is a clear case of double speak, and there seems to be a clear case of thought going into it.
Yes, and you're right about that. And these individuals had the right of appeal against being put on the no-fly list, and apparently they failed. And so it's not as though Canada is officially doing absolutely nothing. It's not as though Canada has a well-thought-out, considered policy to encourage, support, and maintain a Khalistani movement in Canada. They just let it happen by indifference, which is just as much of a sin, in my view.
Okay, but it does not really take us anywhere. My last question to you, Terry, before I let you go. Any clarity on the 4 arrests that have been made till now in the Hardeep Singh Nijjar case? I believe there were some arrests made, 4 of them about a month back. Have you heard anything after that from the Canadian police there investigating this case?
Well, there will be eventually trials. The dates have not been set. But these will be revealing trials, because what we want to know is not who pulled the trigger. We want to know who paid them. That's the key question. Who paid these goons? We know that in the United States, the Americans have dug up hard evidence. They penetrated the plot, and they showed that somebody with something to do with the Indian government did indeed hire an intermediary who hired a hitman to go after Mr. Panoon. In Canada, we haven't got quite that far with the murder of Mr. Nijjar, but we're getting there. The RCMP is indefatigable. They've committed serious resources to this file, and I believe that they will eventually find out who paid these young goons who went after Mr. Nijjar. They have only solved, let me say, half the case. They found who pulled the trigger, not who paid the money.
Right, so it's still sort of in a limbo. And also remember, the RCMP, by the way, has still not officially closed the Kanishka bombing investigation, I believe. On that note, Terry, thank you so much. I believe you could perhaps send in your book to the parliamentarians in Canada so that they are a little better aware of what the Khalistani movement is about. Thank you so much, Terry, for joining us.